When Electronic Arts shut down its studio Visceral Games, which had been working on a new single-player Star Wars game, the gaming community briefly went into panic mode. The game Visceral had been working on had been described as a linear, story-based adventure game, and according to a statement from EA, that style of game in its current form no longer fit with the goals that the company has for it. Because of this, EA has decided to make significant changes to the game in order to, quote, deliver an experience that players will want to come back to and enjoy for a long time to come. Unfortunately, throughout all this, Visceral Studios is closing. But what really got people freaked out was that EA was changing the direction of the game in the first place. Their statement makes it sound like EA no longer believes that big-budget, story-focused single-player games can be successful in the current gaming market. And that probably is exactly the position that EA is coming from right now. That said, EA has had a kind of negative outlook on single-player games for years now, almost a decade. EA doesn't want to make games that you play for 25 hours or so, experience the story, and then never pick up again. They want to make games that people play continuously, over and over, and keep coming back to. So, the traditional style of single-player story game might be dying within EA, but does that mean that it's dying elsewhere in the gaming industry? No, not at all. EA might not be able to make the amount of money that they want to off of this style of single-player game, but it would be ridiculous to say that in 2017, single-player story-focused games haven't been successful. We've got Persona 5, Horizon Zero Dawn, Hellblade, Wolfenstein 2, Nier Automata. I can't even get into all of the different games that I could talk about here because there's just too many, and you get the point already. It's not like every story-focused game has been a huge success, but that's just how things go. You can't have everything be a success. Some stuff has to fail or not quite meet expectations. That's just reality. And it's also reality that the gaming landscape has changed, and that's what EA has been trying to tap into. Games today are bigger than ever before, and they also cost much more to make, so the big publishers have been struggling to keep costs down and profits up. The solution that many of them have reached is to start treating games as a service. This isn't exactly a new concept. Games like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV are literally a service that players pay a monthly subscription to continue playing. And that model has been around for decades. But what we've started to see more often in the last few years is games implement a sort of pseudo-service through systems like loot boxes, paid DLC expansions, and microtransactions. These systems are designed to do two things: make money and keep players coming back to the game so they want to spend more money. What we have when this model works is a game that has a significantly increased lifespan and also developers with more money to continue making content for that game. That sounds great, right? And it is. Kind of. When games as a service works out well, it works out well for pretty much everybody. Developers and publishers have a lot of money that they can use to keep on making games, and the players keep on getting new content. But, just like any model, there are times that games as a service doesn't work well. In these situations, your best case scenario is a gaming experience that feels cheapened by the games as a service model. And at worst, you have games that exploit their players and encourage bad habits and unhealthy lifestyles. Most of the time, the games as a service model relies on a small number of players spending a large amount of money to make up for all of the people who don't spend extra on the game. Cases of people spending $60 on a game and then continuing to spend thousands of dollars on it are surprisingly common. This is obviously a small amount of the player base, but it more than makes up for all of the people who pay just for the base game and don't spend extra money. Through this games as a service model, publishers are making millions, sometimes billions of dollars more than they would just on base game sales alone. And they see this as gamers voting with their wallets that this is what works. To big publishers like EA and Activision, games as a service is the best way to get the large amounts of money they want to make the big budget games that they want to make. But clearly, games as a service doesn't work for every type of game. This is why we have the situation with Visceral's Star Wars game. A linear, story-based action game doesn't support this kind of games as a service model over an extended period of time. But just because EA doesn't want to make this type of game doesn't mean that other developers won't step in to create games that fit that market. And just because EA believes that games as a service is the future of the industry doesn't mean that there's actually as much space for that style of game as they may think. Because when you have a game that acts as a service and wants players to keep coming back, that requires a time commitment on the part of the player. And the more games there are that try this service model, the more competition there will be to keep the attention of each player. The way I see it, the most likely future is one where there's a small number of AAA, high-budget games as a service that really thrive, while other ones that try to compete are kind of ignored and cast to the wayside. That is, until something is new enough to capture everybody's attention all over again. And in this whole scenario, single-player story games don't go away. A lot of gamers are going to be able to focus on one, maybe two of these service-type games at a time, but that's not always going to be the only thing that they're playing. We already see this. A lot of people will play a game with their friends consistently, but when they want to play something by themselves, they'll turn to a host of other single-player games that they have available to them. What we're probably going to see in the next few years isn't so much of a change in what types of games are made and played, but a change in who is making those types of games. Big AAA publishers can continue to focus on large-scale multiplayer games as a service, while smaller, lower-budget developers can continue making single-player story-focused experiences. And of course, we're still going to see overlap between the two groups and what types of games that they make. But there's a few things that I really want to point out here. First is that it costs a lot of money to make a multiplayer game. In fact, it usually costs a lot more money than a single-player game. This is why big publishers are pretty well suited to use the games as a service model to fund these types of multiplayer experiences. And I also want to point out that a low-budget single-player game doesn't mean that it's going to sacrifice the quality that we've seen from extremely high-budget single-player games in the past. Making video games is currently more accessible than it ever used to be, and we're seeing extremely talented individuals find ways to make games of astounding quality without using as many resources as the big AAA publishers have in the past for their games. As time passes, the line between big-budget AAA developed games and smaller independent projects is becoming increasingly blurred. This puts the gaming industry in the position to change a lot internally, but not seem to change very much on the surface. Maybe the heart of the gaming industry is in these smaller, low-budget, sometimes independent studios. And just because a big AAA studio doesn't want to focus on a particular genre of game, it doesn't mean that that type of game is dying. No matter what kind of game you want to play, there's going to be somebody out there making it. It might be a big AAA studio, it might be a smaller studio, an independent studio, it might be one guy or girl in their living room. It might be you.